Nobody tells you that the hardest thing about retiring after 31 years on the force isn't the silence, it's the instinct. You spend 3 decades reading rooms, reading people, knowing when something is wrong before you can name what it is. That instinct doesn't clock out when you do. It follows you home, sits across from you at the breakfast table, and taps you on the shoulder in the middle of the night when your gut says something isn't right. That's what brought me home 4 days early from the fishing trip. Not bad weather, not an emergency. Just that quiet, persistent feeling in my chest that something was off. The same feeling I'd learned to trust back when I was working homicide in Knoxville, and it had never once been wrong. I'd worked 31 years as a detective, the last 11 as lead investigator in the homicide division. I'd seen what people were capable of when they thought no one was watching. I'd sat across tables from men who looked like good fathers and good neighbors and who had done unspeakable things. I knew how deception worked from the inside out. I thought that knowledge had made me immune to being fooled by the people I loved. I was wrong. My wife and I had moved to the mountains of western North Carolina 18 years ago, before we were even thinking about retirement. We'd found the property by accident, 15 acres in the Blue Ridge foothills outside of a small town called Weaverville, with an old farmhouse that hadn't been loved in 40 years. My wife had seen the bones of it. I'd seen the work. We bought it anyway, because that's what you do when you find something worth saving. I rebuilt that house board by board over the course of 6 years of weekends and vacations and long summer breaks when our kids were old enough to hand me tools without losing fingers. My wife stripped every inch of original hardwood and refinished it herself. She chose the colors, planted the garden, turned the overgrown mess behind the barn into something that made people slow their cars down when they drove past in June. We built a life out there. A real one, with roots. When I retired 2 years ago at 62, we finally moved up full-time. My wife had retired from school administration the year before, 34 years as a teacher and principal. We weren't old. We weren't slowing down. We were exactly where we'd always planned to be, healthy and capable, and looking at 20 good years ahead of us in the mountains we loved. Our son lived in Charlotte, 2.5 hours away, and drove up most holidays. He worked in cybersecurity, quiet and methodical, the kind of man who noticed things and kept his own counsel until he was certain. He'd always been that way, even as a child. Our daughter lived in Atlanta with her husband, who she'd married 4 years ago after a whirlwind courtship that had given me pause even then, though I'd kept my mouth shut because she was 34 years old, and I respected her judgment. I should not have kept my mouth shut. My son-in-law was charming. That was the first thing you noticed, and it was, I understood later, the most dangerous thing about him. He was the kind of man who remembered your drink order and your college team and asked follow-up questions that made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. He'd done well in commercial real estate for a while. Then the pandemic had scrambled the market, and he'd pivoted to cryptocurrency investments, which he talked about with the same bright confidence he applied to everything, and which I had quietly, instinctively distrusted from the first time he explained them to me at our kitchen table. I'm a detective. I know what confidence as a cover story looks like. My daughter worked in estate law, good at her job, respected by her clients. She was warm and organized and devoted to her husband in a way that I think, looking back, had more to do with loyalty than genuine happiness. She would not leave him when things got hard. That was not a flaw in her character, but it was the hinge on which everything turned. The fishing trip had been planned for months. 4 of us, retired law enforcement, heading to a cabin on the Watauga River in Tennessee for 10 days. My wife had driven down to Atlanta the previous Wednesday to stay with our daughter and help her recover from a minor knee surgery. Nothing serious. A procedure she'd been putting off for 2 years, finally scheduled for a Tuesday, and my wife wanted to be there for the recovery. I'd called every evening. My wife sounded fine. My daughter sounded fine. Everything sounded fine. On the 6th day of the trip, one of my friends got a call that his mother had fallen. We packed up early. The other 2 stayed. I drove home alone, taking the long way through Asheville because I wanted to stop for coffee, and because I was in no particular hurry, and because the October mountains were doing what they always did in October, burning gold and red against a sky so blue it looked unreal. I pulled into our driveway at 4 in the afternoon on a Thursday that no one was expecting me. There were 2 cars parked by the barn that I didn't recognize, A silver Mercedes that looked like it belonged to someone who wanted you to know they'd paid for it, and a dark blue pickup with a North Carolina contractor's plate. The house lights were on, even though it was still full daylight. My wife's car wasn't there, which made sense. She was still in Atlanta. I sat in my truck for a moment. 31 years of instinct said, "Go slow." I left my bag in the truck and walked around the side of the house, staying close to the tree line, moving the way I'd moved on dozens of approach operations over the years. Old habits. The kind that live in your body and don't ask your permission before they activate. The back porch wrapped the length of the house, looking out over my wife's garden and the field beyond it. 3 people stood at the far end of it. My daughter and her husband, and a man I'd never seen before, heavy-set and 60. With the careful posture of someone who spent a lot of time trying to look trustworthy. He had blueprints in his hand. He was pointing at the barn. "That structure needs to come down," he was saying. "But the acreage is what we're selling here, not the improvements. Buyers at this price point are going to want to demo and build custom anyway." My son-in-law leaned against the porch rail with his arms crossed, nodding. "What's the timeline if we move forward after the assessment?" 60 to 90 days for full transfer, the man said. "Depending on how clean the competency ruling comes through. These things can move fast if the documentation is solid." Competency ruling. I felt something cold move through me. My daughter was standing with her back partly turned, and I could see the tension in her shoulders, the particular stiffness of someone who is pretending to be comfortable with something they aren't. She said, "The assessment is scheduled for next Friday. The doctor my husband spoke with is confident, based on the history we provided, that the evaluation will reflect what we've documented." What you've documented, I thought. I hadn't seen a doctor. My wife hadn't seen a doctor. Not for anything related to our minds or our memory. I stepped up onto the porch. All 3 of them turned at once. My daughter's face went the color of old ash. Her husband's eyes did something quick and calculating, the kind of rapid internal adjustment that most people miss, but that I had spent 3 decades learning to catch. The other man simply looked uncomfortable. I looked at my daughter first, because she was still my daughter, and I wanted to give her the chance to explain. I said, quietly, "Someone want to tell me what an assessment is and why my barn needs to come down." The man with the blueprints introduced himself. He was a property developer out of Asheville, he said. He'd been in conversation with my son-in-law about a potential acquisition. He was sorry if there had been a miscommunication. He said it the way people say that phrase when they know perfectly well there hasn't been a miscommunication, and they're hoping to exit before the situation clarifies itself. I told him he could stay. I said it the way I used to tell witnesses they could stay, which didn't leave room for interpretation. My son-in-law recovered first. He always recovered first. He put his hands in his pockets and gave me the easy smile and said, "We were just exploring options. Looking at what the property could be worth if you and Mom ever decided to downsize. You're not as young as you used to be. These winters up here are no joke." "I'm 62, I said. "I ran a half marathon in April. Try again." His smile adjusted slightly. "We've been concerned," he said. "Both of us. Your wife has been confused lately, forgetting things. She missed a bill last month, the electric, and you've seemed, I don't know, scattered. It happens at your age. It doesn't mean anything, but it means you should have someone in your corner who can help manage things when it gets harder." "My wife handles our finances electronically," I said, "through an auto-pay system she set up 3 years ago. The only way she would miss the electric bill is if someone canceled the automatic payment." I looked at him steadily. "Someone with access to our account." His expression didn't change. He was good. Most liars are bad at it, and you can see the seams. He was genuinely good, which meant he'd had practice. My daughter said, "Dad, please. This isn't what it looks like." "Then tell me what it looks like." She pressed her lips together. She couldn't quite do it. She looked at her husband, and then she looked at the middle distance, somewhere between me and the garden, and she said, "We found a doctor, a specialist. He's going to do a cognitive evaluation, just to have a baseline, just to know where things stand. I haven't agreed to any evaluation." "You don't have to agree," my son-in-law said, and there was something different in his voice now, something that had stopped pretending to be kind. "If the documentation supports the clinical picture, the court can appoint us as your legal guardians without your consent. It's for your protection. It's so someone responsible is making decisions. I sat down in my own porch chair and looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at the developer with his blueprints. Then I looked at my daughter. I said, "How much does he owe?" Silence. "Cryptocurrency?" I said. "How much?" My daughter's eyes filled. She said, "That doesn't matter." "It matters to me. It explains why my barn needs to come down and a cognitive evaluation has been scheduled without my knowledge." "How much?" My son-in-law said, "This isn't about money. Everything you've just described is about money." I kept my voice the way I'd learned to keep it in interrogation rooms, level and patient, and entirely without heat. Because heat tells the person across from you that you can be rattled, and you never want them to know that. I said, "You're going to have us declared incompetent so you can take guardianship, liquidate our assets, and use the proceeds to cover your losses. I want to know the number." He said nothing. I took out my phone and called my son. He answered on the second ring. I said, "I need you to come up to the house. Now, tonight if you can manage it." He heard something in my voice the way he always had, even as a child, that particular frequency that told him this was not a casual request. He said, "I'll leave in an hour." "What's happening?" "I'll explain when you get here. Bring your laptop." I hung up and looked at my son-in-law. He was watching me with an expression that had gone flat and careful. My daughter said, "Dad, Tyler doesn't need to be involved in this." I said, "His name is your brother, and he's already involved. You involved him when you started planning to take everything we built. Sit down. We're going to wait." The developer with the blueprints said, "I really should be going. You're a material witness to a conspiracy to commit fraud." I said pleasantly, "I'd prefer you to stay until I can get your contact information and a statement. I spent 31 years in law enforcement. I know exactly what charges apply here, and exactly how the documentation will look. If you cooperate voluntarily, your position is significantly different than if I have to track you down later." He sat back down. My son-in-law said, "You're bluffing. You don't have anything. It's our word against yours." I looked at him. I said, "I have never bluffed in my life. I found it was always more effective to simply wait." We waited. My daughter cried quietly, turned away from all of us, looking out over the garden her mother had planted. I watched her and felt the grief of it, not the anger, not yet, just the grief of watching your child become a person you don't recognize. She had been such a fearless little girl, sharp and funny, and absolutely certain of her own compass. Somewhere in the 4 years of that marriage, the compass had been moved. My son-in-law made 2 phone calls. I could hear him talking in a low voice around the corner of the porch. He came back and said the family trust documents were already prepared. All it would take was the cognitive assessment. He said it the way you describe something inevitable, a weather pattern, a tide. I said, "Who is the doctor?" "A specialist in elder cognitive decline. Dr. Brennan Whitfield, practices in Charlotte." I said, "I've never met anyone named Whitfield. You don't have to have met him. He works from documentation, reports from family members, observable behavioral patterns. It's a standard process." I said, "It's fraud." My son-in-law said, "It's family advocacy." We sat in silence after that until the headlights came up the driveway at 10:45 that night. My son walked onto the porch and looked at his sister and her husband and the developer who had long since given me his card and stopped making eye contact with anyone. My son looked at all of them and then he looked at me and he said, "How long has this been going on?" I said, "I don't know the full shape of it yet. I was hoping you might." He sat down, opened his laptop and said, 3 months. My daughter made a sound. He said, "I didn't say anything because I wasn't certain. I needed to be certain before I brought it to you." He looked at his sister. "I'm sorry. I am genuinely sorry it came to this, but I've been watching the accounts." He turned the laptop around. I recognized our joint checking account, the one my wife and I had maintained for 30 years. There were 3 withdrawals over the past 8 weeks, small enough to look like ordinary transactions, large enough to matter when you added them up. $1,600 total, routed through a payment platform to an address that, when my son pulled up the registration, resolved to a shell company with my son-in-law's email address as the contact. "That's our grocery money," I said. My wife and I budget $800 a month for household expenses. Someone has been skimming from it. My son-in-law said, "That's a misinterpretation of legitimate transactions." My son said, "I also spoke with Dr. Brennan Whitfield, the real one. He practices in Charlotte. I called his office this morning and spoke with his nurse. He has no record of your father or mother as patients. He has never been contacted by either of you. He has no knowledge of any cognitive evaluation being arranged in his name. And he is, as of this morning, in contact with his malpractice attorney about unauthorized use of his credentials." My daughter put her face in her hands. "There's more," my son said. He'd been building this, I realized, the way I used to build a case. Quietly, methodically, one layer at a time, not showing his hand until it was complete. He pulled up a document, the power of attorney form that my son-in-law had mentioned, the one that would grant them full control over our health decisions and our finances once the fraudulent cognitive assessment came back. My son had shown it to 2 attorneys, he said. Both had flagged 3 sections that were not standard language, sections that waived our right to independent legal review, that transferred decision-making authority without a sunset clause, and that included a provision I had never seen in any legal document, a clause that preemptively invalidated any challenge to the guardianship that we might attempt to bring on the grounds of, and I am quoting, temporary periods of cognitive clarity that do not reflect the ongoing clinical picture. In other words, if we tried to fight back, the document itself argued that the attempt to fight back was evidence of our decline. It was clever, I'll give him that. It was the kind of thing a man with no conscience and considerable intelligence might design when he was desperate enough and had run out of other options. "How much?" I asked again. My son looked at his brother-in-law. He said, $430,000. Crypto positions that went to zero over 14 months, plus margin loans on top of them. He owes institutional lenders and 2 private individuals whose names I found in his email. The private lenders have been sending collection notices to his office. One of them is a former business associate with a civil judgment against him in Georgia. My daughter raised her head. She said, "He told me it was 200,000. My son-in-law said nothing. She said it again, quieter. "You told me it was $200,000. He looked at the floor of my porch and said nothing. I watched my daughter understand something in real time. I have seen that happen to people before, in the worst context imaginable, and it is a terrible thing to witness. The moment when the story someone has been living collapses and the real shape of things becomes visible, and there is nowhere to go and nothing to do but stand in the middle of it. She said, "I drugged my mother's tea." The porch went silent. She said it again, to no one in particular, to the night air, to herself. She said, "I put her anxiety medication in her tea on Sunday night so she would sleep and not ask questions about the papers." She was getting upset about the power of attorney and she stopped. She pressed both hands flat on the table. I told myself it was for her own good. I had to stand up. I had to put my hands on the porch rail and look out at the dark field and breathe for a moment. Because I was a man who had dealt with terrible things professionally for 30 years, and I was not prepared for this. Not from her. My wife had been confused on Sunday night. She had called me and said she was tired, that she couldn't quite follow the conversation, that she kept losing her train of thought. I had attributed it to the stress of being away from home and the recovery from her daughter's knee surgery. I had told her to sleep and that I'd be home soon. She'd been medicated without her knowledge or consent, in her own daughter's house. I picked up my phone and dialed my wife. She answered on the 3rd ring, groggy with the hour. I told her I was home, that I needed her to drive up tomorrow morning, first thing, that everything was all right, but I needed her here. She could hear in my voice that everything was not all right. She said she would leave at 7. I hung up and turned back to the porch. My son-in-law was on his feet. He said, "This is getting out of hand." He said, "We can work this out as a family." He said, "Nobody needs to call anyone." He said, "The last thing any of us wants is for this to become a legal situation." I said, "It became a legal situation when you filed fraudulent documents in a physician's name. It became a criminal situation when my daughter administered a controlled substance to her mother without her knowledge. I've been polite because she's my daughter, and I'm not without mercy, but we're done negotiating. He moved toward the door, toward the inside of the house, and I stepped in front of him. I am 62 years old, and I spent 4 years before the force playing linebacker at the University of Tennessee, and while that was a long time ago, I still have the frame of it. He stopped. I said, "You're going to sit back down." He sat back down. I said to the developer, "You have my card. I have yours. I'll be in touch." He left. I watched his Mercedes back out of the driveway with more urgency than he'd arrived with. Then I called the Buncombe County Sheriff's Department. The deputy who arrived was thorough and unhurried. The best kind of law enforcement, the kind that isn't trying to prove anything. She took statements from all of us separately, which I appreciated. She looked at everything my son had compiled. She made 2 phone calls. At 2 in the morning, she looked at my son-in-law across my kitchen table and told him he was being detained, pending formal charges of fraud, elder financial exploitation, and conspiracy to commit identity theft in connection with the fraudulent use of a licensed physician's credentials. She looked at my daughter and said, "I'd recommend you not leave town and that you get a lawyer." My daughter said nothing. She sat at the kitchen table where she'd sat as a child doing homework, where her mother had helped her with fractions and spelling words and the particular misery of 8th grade algebra, and she stared at the grain of the wood and said nothing. My son-in-law was transported at 2:30 in the morning. I watched the patrol car go down the driveway and felt nothing like satisfaction. I felt tired. I felt the particular exhaustion of a man who has been a detective for 30 years and thought he had left all of this behind. My son made coffee. We sat at the table, the 3 of us, and my daughter finally spoke. She said, "I knew it was wrong. All of it. I knew it from the beginning. But he kept saying we were out of options, that this was the only way, that it was temporary, that we would put money back, that you and Mom would never know." She paused. I let myself believe him because the alternative was admitting that I had married a man who would do this. I said, "How long have you known about the real debt?" She said, 3 weeks. When I saw the collector's letters, he'd been hiding them. I said, "And you still went forward with it?" She said, "I was scared." She said it like she was trying it out to see if it held up, and I could see her realize as she said it that it didn't. She said, "I was a coward. That's the honest answer. I was a coward and I was ashamed, and I let him convince me that protecting him was the same as protecting the family." I looked at my daughter for a long moment. She was 36 years old. She had her mother's eyes and my jawline, and she had been a fierce and joyful child, and somewhere in the recent years she had gotten very small. I said, "What your mother drank on Sunday night." She said, 1 milligram of lorazepam dissolved in chamomile tea. It's her prescription. I took it from her bag. She said it quietly and steadily, because she knew what it was, and she wasn't going to flinch from it. Whatever else she was, she had always been honest when directly confronted with a thing. I had given her that much. I said, "You'll tell that to the prosecutor." She said, "I know." She left before dawn, driving back to Atlanta with a number for a criminal defense attorney that my son wrote on a gas receipt and slid across the table without comment. My wife arrived at 10 the next morning. I met her in the driveway and held her for a long time in the pale October light with the mountains behind us doing their October thing, and I told her everything. She stood very still while I told her. She asked 2 questions, both about her daughter. Then she nodded once, the way she used to nod when she'd made a difficult decision in her years as a principal, and she said, "Let's go inside, I'll make breakfast." The weeks that followed had the quality of bad weather that you can't do anything about, except wait for it to pass. The charges against my son-in-law were filed formally: wire fraud, elder financial exploitation, identity theft, conspiracy. The district attorney's office added a charge related to the financial account manipulation when my son's documentation cleared forensic review. The fraudulent cognitive assessment scheme was referred to the state medical board in addition to the criminal proceeding. My daughter cooperated fully with the prosecutor's investigation. She provided testimony about the planning, the timeline, the conversations she had witnessed and participated in. She disclosed everything, including what she had given her mother in the tea, and when and why. The prosecutor declined to bring criminal charges against her in exchange for full cooperation and the completion of a restorative justice program that the DA's office had been piloting for cases involving family members in family. non-violent elder exploitation. Part of that program required a public acknowledgement. It happened in January at a community forum on elder abuse prevention hosted by the Buncombe County Department of Social Services. 30-odd people in a fluorescent-lit meeting room in Asheville, social workers and law enforcement liaisons and community advocates, and a handful of reporters who had followed the case when it became public record. My wife and I sat in the second row. My daughter stood at the front of the room with a single sheet of paper she had written herself, and she didn't look at it once. She said, "My name is Allison, and my husband and I attempted to have my parents declared legally incompetent so that we could seize control of their assets and property and use the proceeds to cover $430,000 in gambling debts that I only partially knew about." She said it flat and factual, the way you say a thing you've already accepted and are done softening. She said, "My parents are not incompetent. My father is a retired homicide detective who rebuilt our family home with his hands over 6 years of weekends. My mother is a retired school principal who taught and administered for 34 years and who is sharper than I am on my best day. I told myself we were helping them. I told myself they were getting older and needed someone to look after their interests. The truth is they didn't need anyone to look after their interests. I needed money, and I chose the worst possible way to get it." She paused. The room was quiet, the way rooms get quiet when everyone in them is listening completely. She said, "I gave my mother a sedative in her tea without her knowledge or consent so that she would sign documents she didn't want to sign. I used my mother's medication against her." She looked directly at my wife when she said it, the first time she had looked at her directly since that night. She said, "There is no framing of that act that makes it acceptable. None. I've tried every framing, and they all resolve to the same thing, which is that I betrayed the person who raised me because I was too frightened and too ashamed to ask for help." She said, "If you are in a family with aging parents, I am asking you to look honestly at what you feel when you think about their house, their savings, their estate. If there is any part of you that has calculated what you might inherit and when, I am not judging you. That's human. But if that calculation has started to influence how you see them, if you have started to quietly reframe their ordinary lapses as signs of decline, if you have started to wonder whether they really need to stay in that house, I am asking you to stop and examine that honestly, because that is where it starts. That is exactly where it started for me, and I cannot get back what I cost my family." The room stayed quiet when she finished. My wife reached over and took my hand. We didn't speak to our daughter afterward. We weren't ready. We drove home through the mountains in the dark, and my wife looked out the window at the passing ridgelines and said, "She sounded like herself." At the end, she sounded like the girl I raised. I said, "I know." She said, "That doesn't fix it." I said, "No, it doesn't." My son-in-law went to trial in March. He had hired a good attorney, and the attorney had done what good attorneys do, which is find every possible angle and exploit every possible ambiguity, and it still wasn't enough. My son's documentation was comprehensive, and the physician whose name had been used in the fraud was an angry and articulate witness, and the jury took 7 hours, which is not a long time for a case with this many documents. The judge sentenced him to 8 years. He cited the deliberate and systematic nature of the scheme, the use of fraudulent medical documentation to exploit perceived vulnerability, and the particular cruelty of targeting people whose trust in him had been unconditional. He said, "The law takes seriously the exploitation of those whom society expects us to protect. You understood that and chose to weaponize it. My wife and I sat in the courtroom for that. We held hands, and we listened. And when it was done, we went to a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse and ordered pancakes at 2 in the afternoon because we could, because we were free, because the house was ours and the land was ours and nobody was taking any of it. Spring came the way it always comes in the Blue Ridge, sudden and extravagant. My wife put in the garden the 2nd week of April, earlier than she usually did, as if she needed to assert something. I repaired the section of fence along the south field that had been bothering me since November, and never seemed to find the time for. My son brought his family up for Easter, and his kids ran through the yard in the cold spring sun, and my wife chased them and didn't catch them on purpose. A letter arrived from our daughter in May. My wife and I sat on the porch with it between us for a while, before either of us spoke. "She's in therapy," my wife said, not because she'd read it yet, but because she'd been expecting it. I said, I assume so. My wife picked it up, and then she set it back down. She said, I'm not ready. I said, I know. She said, do you think you'll ever be? I looked out over the garden, the raised beds she'd put in along the south side of the house the first summer we'd come here, 18 years ago, when our daughter had been 18 and our son 16, and we'd spent a whole weekend, all four of us, pulling up old fence posts and turning the soil. Our daughter had complained about the work and then gotten very into it, the way she did with most things, and at the end of the day she'd been filthy and satisfied, and she'd said, next year I want tomatoes, and we'd grown tomatoes every year after that, without ever quite deciding to. We'd grown tomatoes this year too, I said. I don't know. Maybe. Not today. My wife nodded. She put the letter in the small basket on the porch table where she keeps things she isn't done with yet, seeds and receipts and notes in her own handwriting, not thrown away, not answered, present. My son called every Sunday. His kids were 9 and 7, and they asked to talk to me specifically, which I took as evidence of my own good standing in the world. The 9-year-old wanted to know if she could go fishing with me this summer, and I said yes, absolutely. And she said she already knew how to cast because her dad had been teaching her. And I said, is that so? And she said, yes, but I want to learn your way. I told her we'd have the whole summer for it. I didn't hear from our daughter again until June. Not a letter this time, a phone call to my wife's cell on a Tuesday evening when I was out doing a last check on the fence before dark. My wife answered it and talked for 40 minutes, standing at the kitchen window with the light going golden outside. I came in, and she was still on the phone. She looked at me with an expression I have seen on her face 1,000 times in 39 years of marriage, the expression of someone holding two contradictory things in each hand and not quite ready to put either one down. She wrapped up the call. She said she got a job, paralegal, small firm in Charlotte. She said she's filing for divorce. The papers were served last week. I said, how does she sound? My wife thought about it. She said, small, but like herself. Like she's rebuilding from the actual foundation instead of just the parts that were showing. I said, that's something. My wife said, it is. We stood in the kitchen for a moment in the early summer evening with the window open and the garden smell coming in and the last of the light catching the old hardwood floors. I'd refinished myself, the third winter we owned this place. I said, I'm not ready to call her. My wife said, I know. Me neither. But someday. I said, yeah, someday. We ate dinner on the porch that evening, late enough that the fireflies had started in the field below the barn, which is one of the things about this property that I have never stopped noticing no matter how many times I've seen it. The mountains went purple and then dark and then just a presence you could feel more than see, and my wife poured us each a glass of wine, and we sat there in our chairs looking at the place we'd built and protected and refused to give up. She said, I've been thinking about the tomatoes. I said, what about them? She said, we should put in more this year, a whole additional row on the east side. The drainage is better there anyway. I said, we're not going to be able to eat that many tomatoes. She said, I know. We can give them away, or I can learn to can them properly. Your mother used to can. She used to, I said. She did a lot of things I never learned. My wife said, we have time. And we did. That was the thing I kept coming back to in the months that followed, in the quiet mornings with the mist still in the valley and the slow evenings on the porch. We had time. We were not old. We were not diminished. We were two people in our early 60s with a house we'd built ourselves and a piece of mountain land and 39 years of practice at loving each other through hard things, and we had every reason in the world to expect 20 good years ahead of us if we were careful with our health and a little bit lucky with everything else. What my son-in-law had understood and used and gotten entirely wrong was that he thought our age was the vulnerability. He thought the number 62 meant something soft at the center, something that could be pressed on until it gave. He thought the word retirement meant we'd handed in our sharpness along with the badge. He had not done his homework. I had spent 31 years figuring out how the worst kind of people thought, how they identified targets and calculated angles and built their confidence on the assumption that no one was paying close enough attention. I had come home from that fishing trip because 31 years of pattern recognition had told me to. I had walked around the side of my own house, and stayed in the shadows because that was what you did when you needed to understand a situation before you altered it. I had sat on my own porch and waited, calmly, for the whole shape of the thing to become clear, because patience is not a passive quality. It is the most active kind of intelligence there is. You do not get to 62 by being careless. You don't build a marriage for 39 years by failing to pay attention to the person beside you. You don't finish 31 years in homicide without developing a very precise understanding of what it means when someone is lying to your face. He had looked at us and seen two people past their prime with property worth selling. He'd been looking at the wrong thing entirely. The house was ours. The land was ours. The fireflies came back every June, and the tomatoes went in every April, and the mountain turned orange every October, and none of that was going anywhere. We had stood in the worst of it, and come out the other side still standing, still together, still entirely ourselves. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes that's everything. My wife fell asleep in her chair on the porch that June evening, the wine glass tilted in her hand, and I took it gently before it fell and covered her with the blanket we keep folded over the arm of the chair for exactly this kind of evening. I sat beside her in the growing dark and listened to the field and the trees and the particular silence of a mountain night that isn't really silence at all. I thought about forgiveness, about what it requires and what it costs, and whether it's something you decide or something that simply arrives when the conditions are finally right for it. I thought about my daughter's voice on the phone with her mother, small but like herself. I thought about the letter still in the basket on the table. I didn't open it that night. I wasn't ready, but I didn't throw it away either. And somewhere in the difference between those two things, I think, is where the rest of the story lives. Not yet written, not yet closed, just present, the way certain things are, waiting quietly until you are ready to look at them straight. The mountains were dark around us, and the stars were doing what they always do up here, which is remind you that you are small, and that being small is not a bad thing. And I sat with my sleeping wife in our house, in our mountains, on our land, and I was at peace. Not because everything had been fixed. It hadn't. But because what mattered was still ours, and we had fought for it, and we had won, and tomorrow there would be coffee in the morning light, and my wife's garden, and the slow, ordinary work of a life being lived on its own terms. That's what we'd built here. That's what no one was taking.